My name is Helen, I'm 76 years old, and for the better part of my life, I've been told I am too soft-hearted for my own good. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the moment I stood in the pastor's office, shaking from head to toe, hoping for help, and realizing I had walked straight into another kind of danger. His hand was on mine, not in prayer, but slowly creeping up my arm in a way no man of God should ever touch a woman. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst, but I stayed frozen. His voice whispering things that made my stomach twist. I had come to report my husband's abuse. Instead, the man I thought would protect me leaned in with a smirk that told me he had his own plan. My breath caught in my throat and I prayed, this time not for comfort but for a way out. The first time my husband, Robert, raised his hand to me, I told myself it was stress. He'd been laid off from his job at the paper mill, and the bills had piled up faster than the leaves in October. I wanted to believe it was just frustration spilling over. But deep down, something in me knew it was more than that. It was control. And once a man gets the taste of that kind of power, he rarely gives it up. Still, I clung to my vows, telling myself things would get better. But they didn't. And each day, the bruises just got easier for him to explain away, and harder for me to hide. I remember the night that pushed me over the edge. It was raining, hard like the heavens themselves were angry, and Robert came home smelling like whiskey and cheap perfume. I asked where he'd been, and before I could blink, my cheek was on fire. He hit me so hard I saw stars. I stumbled into the kitchen, holding the counter for balance, and he just laughed. "Don't start, Helen," he said like I was the problem. That night I decided I had to tell someone. But who? My own sister told me years ago that marriage was a woman's private burden, and my neighbors had enough gossip of their own. That's when I thought of Pastor James. Pastor James had been the head of our church for over 20 years. He had baptized my children, prayed over my mother when she passed, and spoken fiery sermons about protecting the vulnerable. If there was one man I thought would stand up to Robert, it was him. The next morning, I put on my thickest sweater to cover the marks on my arms, and I walked through the church doors, rehearsing in my mind how I'd explain everything without breaking down. The secretary told me the pastor was free, so I stepped into his office. He greeted me with a warm smile, closed the door, and asked what was wrong. I started talking, my voice shaking but my words pouring out like water from a broken dam, about the yelling, the beatings, the fear. He listened closely, nodding, but something in his eyes made me uneasy. When I finally stopped to take a breath, he leaned forward, placed his hand over mine and said, "Helen, sometimes God sends us trials to see how much we can endure. But there are other ways to ease the pain." The way he said "other ways" sent a chill up my spine. I told myself I was imagining it, that maybe he was just speaking in a strange tone. But then his hand began to slide slowly, deliberately, up my arm. My body tensed, my breath hitched, and my mind screamed at me to get up and leave. Yet I stayed frozen, his words turning softer, darker, until they were no longer about faith at all. My heart was pounding so loudly, I barely heard the sound of the office door clicking shut behind me when he got up from his chair. And that's when I realized, I might have just traded one predator for another. If you want to know what I did next, stay tuned for the next chapter. This story is about survival, about the strength we forget we have until life forces it out of us. If you're following along, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss the next part, because the truth I'm about to uncover will shake everything you thought you knew about trust. I don't know if it was the sound of the rain pelting against the stained glass windows or the sudden stillness in the room that made my heart race faster, but something in me knew. If I didn't get out of that office soon, something would happen that I could never take back. Pastor James stepped closer, his voice lowering to a whisper that was supposed to sound comforting but carried something foul beneath it. "Helen, you've carried this burden alone for too long. Let me take care of you." His hand brushed my shoulder, and I flinched so hard he chuckled under his breath. That chuckle was the moment I snapped back into myself. It wasn't the laugh of a shepherd of God. It was the laugh of a man who knew he held power over someone vulnerable. My breathing grew shallow. Every instinct screamed for me to move, to run, to do anything but stand there like prey. But as I turned to reach for the door, he blocked me with a gentle step, still smiling. "Don't be afraid. You can trust me." The words might have soothed someone else, but they felt like chains around my ankles. I forced myself to keep my voice steady. "Pastor James, I need some air." I prayed he would let me pass, but instead he tilted his head and said, "We're just talking, Helen. There's nothing to be afraid of in here." His eyes didn't match his words. They were hungry, searching. That hunger was what finally lit the fire inside me. I took a deep breath, stepped back, and said in a tone I didn't know I had, "I came here for help. Not this." For a moment, his expression faltered. It was only for a second, but I saw the real man behind the robe. The irritation, the disappointment, the control slipping from his fingers. Then he smiled again, this time tighter. "Of course. If you're not ready, we can talk another time." That phrase, "another time," sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't know if he meant it as a threat or a promise, but I knew I couldn't leave without a plan. When I finally stepped out into the main hall, the secretary was gone. The church felt eerily empty, and my footsteps echoed like warnings. I walked home fast, my hands shaking, my mind replaying every second of that encounter. The image of Robert's smirk when he hit me had always been the thing that haunted my nights, but now there was another face beside his. That night I didn't sleep. My body was exhausted, but my mind wouldn't rest. How could the man who baptized my children look at me like that? How could the one place I thought was safe feel more dangerous than my own home? I kept telling myself I must have misunderstood, but deep down I knew exactly what I felt. That wasn't a misunderstanding. That was a warning. The next morning, Robert was in a foul mood again. He slammed his coffee mug on the table so hard it cracked, muttering about the bills. "Maybe if you were worth something, Helen, we wouldn't be in this mess." His words cut deeper than his blows sometimes. I sat there in silence, not daring to tell him where I had gone the day before. But when I caught my reflection in the kitchen window, I saw it, the flicker in my own eyes. The fear was still there, but something else had taken root. Determination. I knew I couldn't stay in this cycle. I had two battles now. One with the man who wore the wedding ring, and one with the man who wore the collar. And I realized that to survive I had to be careful, smart, and above all, patient. This wasn't going to be a quick escape. This was going to be a war. But wars need allies, and I didn't have any yet. Or so I thought. Because that very afternoon, someone from the church called my house. Not Pastor James, but a woman I barely knew, and what she told me was the first crack in his holy armor. What she said left me gripping the phone so tightly I thought it would shatter. You won't want to miss what I found out next. If you're following this story, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe so you're here for the next chapter, because the truth about Pastor James is darker than I ever imagined. The voice on the other end of the line was shaky, almost hesitant, like she wasn't sure if she should be calling me at all. "Helen. This is Mary Lou, from the Tuesday prayer group." I remembered her. A petite woman in her early 60s with kind eyes, always the first to volunteer for church events. I hadn't spoken to her outside the church before, so her call took me by surprise. I hope I'm not bothering you," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I heard you were at the church yesterday, talking to Pastor James." My heart froze in my chest. I hadn't told a soul about that meeting. "Who told you that?" I asked, my voice low but sharp. She hesitated, then said, "I can't tell you over the phone. But Helen, you're not the first woman to walk into his office for help and walk out looking like she wanted to disappear." Those words went through me like ice water. My grip on the receiver tightened. "What are you saying, Mary Lou?" "Press." She paused for a moment, and when she spoke again, there was a tremor in her tone. "I'm saying, I've heard things, and I've seen things. He's not who everyone thinks he is." I wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but before I could, she said, "Meet me at the diner on Main Street tomorrow morning. 10 o'clock. We can't talk about this on the phone. It's not safe." She hung up before I could answer. For the rest of the evening, Her words played over and over in my mind. You're not the first woman. Not who everyone thinks he is. I couldn't decide if I was terrified, relieved, or both. If what she was hinting at was true, then my instincts yesterday were right, and I wasn't alone in seeing through his mask. But if it was true, it also meant I was stepping into something much bigger than I realized. Robert noticed I was distracted that night. He paced the living room, ranting about the electric bill, waving it in my face like I had personally drained the lights. You sit in this house all day doing nothing, and I'm the one breaking my back, he snapped, even though I knew he hadn't worked in months. His shouting didn't even register in the same way it used to. My mind was elsewhere, on tomorrow's meeting, on Mary Lou's cryptic warning. That night I barely slept. My thoughts were a knot of dread and curiosity. What could Mary Lou possibly know? And why did she sound so afraid? By the time the sun rose, I had already decided I was going to that diner no matter what. The next morning, I slipped on my long wool coat and scarf, making sure Robert was still in bed before I left. The cold air bit at my cheeks as I walked the few blocks to Main Street. The diner's neon sign buzzed faintly, and through the fogged-up windows, I spotted Mary Lou sitting in the back booth, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of coffee. When I slid into the seat across from her, she didn't waste time. Helen, I don't know how much you've already seen, but I know enough to tell you. You need to be careful. Her eyes darted toward the door, as if she expected him to walk in at any moment. She leaned in, her voice low. 3 years ago, my niece went to him for counseling after her husband left her. She came out crying, and she never went back to church again. She told me later he'd touched her in a way that made her skin crawl, and when she tried to pull away, he told her she was misinterpreting God's comfort. Mary Lou's face hardened. And she's not the only one. There are others, but they're too scared to speak up. My stomach churned. Why hasn't anyone done anything? Yes. She shook her head. Because he's the pastor, Helen. He's got the board, the deacons, half the town in his pocket. Anyone who speaks against him ends up being painted as bitter, unstable, or sinful. I sat back, my mind reeling. The walls of that little booth seemed to close in on me. I had come to him for help with one evil, and discovered another lurking beneath a cross and a polished smile. And now I knew, if I wanted justice, I couldn't just think about escaping Robert. I had to take down Pastor James too. But that was easier said than done. Men like him didn't fall without a fight. And if he suspected I was talking to others, he would make sure I regretted it. Mary Lou reached across the table, gripping my hand. Whatever you decide to do, don't face him alone. He's dangerous in ways you can't imagine. Her words stayed with me as I walked home, the cold wind biting through my coat. When I reached the house, Robert was waiting in the doorway. His face twisted into a frown. Where were you? He demanded. I froze, realizing I was about to have to lie to one man to protect myself from another, and that any wrong move could destroy me. Before I could answer, he stepped closer, his voice dropping. Don't think I don't know when you're hiding something, Helen. And that's when I realized I was already being watched. You don't want to miss what happens next. If you've been following this story, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe so you're here for the next chapter. Because the trap around me was starting to close, and the next step I took would determine whether I got out alive. Robert's eyes locked on mine like he was trying to dig out every secret I had. The air between us felt heavy, charged with the kind of tension that could erupt at any second. I swallowed hard, forcing a small, calm smile. I went for a walk, I said softly. Clears my head. It was true enough to pass as harmless, but I could tell he didn't buy it completely. His lips curled into a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. A walk, huh? Funny how you suddenly need fresh air these days. He stepped aside just enough to let me into the house, but his presence filled the doorway like a wall. My heart pounded as I brushed past him, keeping my face neutral even though my mind was screaming for me to lock myself in the bedroom. The rest of the day, Robert was quieter than usual, but not in a good way. He moved around the house with this eerie stillness, like a predator circling prey. I knew his moods well enough to understand that silence meant calculation, and calculation usually meant trouble was coming. I tried to distract myself with chores, but every time I caught him watching me from across the room, a shiver ran down my spine. That night at dinner, he broke the silence. "You know," he began, stabbing his fork into his plate, "people talk in this town. I'd hate for folks to get the wrong idea about you." He didn't look up when he said it, but the weight of his words landed like a hammer. My pulse quickened. Was he talking about Mary Lou? About me going to the church? Or was it just one of his vague threats meant to keep me in line? I didn't respond. I just kept eating, pretending my appetite wasn't gone. I had learned long ago that silence could sometimes protect me more than words. But inside, my thoughts were racing. If Robert caught wind of what I was doing, or if Pastor James did, my life could become a nightmare worse than anything I'd faced before. The next morning I got a call from Mary Lou again. Her voice was even lower this time, almost a whisper. "Helen, I spoke to someone else. She's willing to talk, but she's scared. We have to meet somewhere he won't think to look." I agreed instantly, the urgency in her tone leaving no room for hesitation. We decided on an abandoned picnic area by the lake, a place that had been empty since the old dock collapsed years ago. When I arrived, the wind off the water was biting, and the trees groaned with each gust. Mary Lou was already there, standing beside a woman I didn't recognize. The woman looked young, too young, and her eyes darted around nervously as if she expected someone to jump out of the shadows. "This is Carla," Mary Lou said softly. She went to Pastor James for help a few months ago." Carla swallowed hard before speaking. "I went to him because my brother died and I couldn't cope. He told me we should meet privately so we could pray without distractions. But that's not what happened." Her voice cracked, and she wrapped her arms around herself. "He touched me. Told me it was part of a spiritual release. When I told him to stop, he said I was tempting him and that I needed forgiveness." I felt the blood drain from my face. It was one thing to suspect. It was another to hear the words laid bare in the cold air. Mary Lou added, "There's more, Helen. Carla's not alone. We've started keeping track, and there are at least 5 women with similar stories. But none of them want to go public because they know what happens to people who cross him." Carla's eyes met mine, and I could see the same mixture of shame and anger I'd been feeling since that day in his office. "If you're planning to do something," she said quietly, "I'll help. I don't want to be the only one." As the wind whipped across the lake, I realized I had stumbled into something far bigger than my own escape from Robert. This wasn't just about my survival anymore. It was about protecting every woman Pastor James thought he could intimidate into silence. When I got home that evening, Robert was sitting in the living room, the TV off, a beer in his hand. He didn't say a word as I walked in, just stared at me with an expression I couldn't read. It wasn't anger this time. It was suspicion. And suspicion, I knew, was even more dangerous. The silence stretched until he finally spoke. "You've been real busy lately, Helen. Should I be worried?" I forced a small laugh. "Only if you're jealous of laundry and grocery runs." But inside my mind was screaming. If he started following me, it wouldn't just be my life on the line. That night, as I lay awake, I knew I had to move faster. The clock was ticking, and the walls were closing in from both sides. I needed a plan, and I needed it before Robert or Pastor James made their next move. What I didn't know was that someone had already started digging into me, and they were getting closer every day. If you've been holding your breath, don't let go just yet. The danger is about to hit a peak, and you won't want to miss what happens in the next chapter. Like, comment, and subscribe so you're here when the truth finally starts to unravel. The next morning, the air in the house felt heavier than usual, like the walls themselves were pressing in. Robert barely spoke to me, but I could feel his suspicion in every glance, every pause before he answered me. He left mid-morning without telling me where he was going, and instead of relief, I felt a wave of unease. Robert didn't usually leave unless it was for drinking or trouble, And sometimes both. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, staring at the steam curling upward, my mind running through everything I'd learned from Mary Lou and Carla. 5 women, maybe more. All silenced, all carrying their pain in secret while Pastor James stood in the pulpit every Sunday, preaching about righteousness. The thought made me sick. I had walked into his office thinking I was seeking refuge, but I had unknowingly stepped into the lair of a predator. Mary Lou called again around noon. "Helen, I've been thinking we need proof. Words alone won't take him down. He's got too many friends on the board and too much influence. But if we can get something solid, recordings, photos, anything, he won't be able to hide behind that collar." The idea of facing him again made my stomach twist, but she was right. Without evidence, we'd just be dismissed as bitter old women with grudges. Still, I wasn't ready to go back into that office alone, not after how his hand had lingered on my arm. "I'll think about it," I told her, though the truth was I was already planning my next move. Late in the afternoon, Robert came back, the door slamming hard enough to rattle the frame. His face was flushed, his breath thick with beer. "Saw Mary Lou today," he said, dropping his coat on the floor. My blood went cold. "She said you've been meeting with her. You didn't mention that to me." I forced a calm expression. "She just needed some company. She's been lonely." Robert leaned against the wall, studying me. "Lonely people talk a lot. Sometimes too much." His tone wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to cut. I held his gaze for as long as I could before looking away, knowing that showing fear would only feed him. That night, after he passed out in his chair, I went to the bedroom and locked the door. My hands trembled as I pulled out the small notepad I kept hidden under my sewing kit. On it, I began to write. Dates, times, everything I could remember from my encounter with Pastor James. The way his eyes lingered. The way his hand moved. His exact words. I didn't know if these notes would ever see the inside of a courtroom, but they would be a start. The next day, I told Mary Lou my decision. "I'll do it. But we can't be careless. If either of them suspects what we're doing, they'll crush us before we get anywhere." We decided to start small. Public spaces, casual conversations, anything that could lure him into revealing a side of himself he didn't show in sermons. That Sunday, I sat in the very front pew, something I hadn't done in years. Pastor James's eyes flickered with recognition when he saw me there, and his smile widened just slightly. After the service, he came over, shook my hand, and held it a second too long. "Helen, it's so good to see you again. I hope you're feeling better." I caught the emphasis on that last word. "Much better," I replied, forcing a smile. "Maybe I should come by this week to talk more." His eyes lit up in a way that made my skin crawl, but I kept my face pleasant. "Of course," he said. "My door is always open." Mary Lou was waiting for me outside, her face pale. "Helen, are you sure about this?" she whispered. "You're walking straight into the lion's den." I looked at her, feeling that new steel in my spine. "Yes," I said. "And I'm going to walk back out with his teeth in my hand." But as I made my way home, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. A dark sedan parked 2 houses down from mine, engine running, windows tinted. And when I glanced back a second time, the car was gone. I didn't know it yet, but I had just caught my first glimpse of the shadow that would follow me for weeks to come. The noose was tightening, and someone had decided to watch my every move. If you've been following this story, like, comment, and subscribe, because in the next chapter, the hunter becomes the hunted, and the truth will only get darker. I couldn't get the image of that dark sedan out of my mind. It wasn't just a random car. I knew the way it lingered. Engine humming, windows too dark to see through, meant someone was watching me. Whether it was Robert, Pastor James, or someone working for them, I didn't know. But I did know one thing. From now on, I had to assume every step I took was being seen. That night, Robert was in a better mood. Almost too good. He laughed at his own jokes, clapped me on the shoulder as he passed, even complimented my cooking. It would have been a relief if I didn't know him so well. Robert only turned on the charm when he wanted to put me off guard. His sudden warmth felt like a trap. After dinner, while he sat in front of the TV, I slipped into the bedroom and took my notepad back out. I reviewed my notes about Pastor James, adding details from the last church service. The tone in his voice, the way he gripped my hand. If I was going to get him, I'd need a pattern. I'd need to show that he behaved the same way with me as he did with the other women. Mary Lou called the next morning. Her voice had that same hushed urgency. "Helen, I think he's getting suspicious. Carla said he's been asking around about you. Just be careful." I sighed, pressing the phone closer to my ear. "I think I'm already being watched." She went quiet for a second. "Then you need to move faster. Have you thought about how you're going to get proof?" I had, and it terrified me. I told her my idea in a low voice, about agreeing to meet Pastor James again, bringing a small recorder hidden in my bag. If I could get him to repeat some of the things he'd said to me before, or worse, make a move again, I'd have something no board member could sweep under the rug. Mary Lou was quiet, then said, "It's risky. But it's the only way." That Wednesday, I called the church office and told the secretary I wanted to schedule a private session with Pastor James. My voice was steady, but my heart felt like it was trying to leap out of my chest. She booked me for Friday afternoon. That gave me 2 days to prepare, and to fight off the feeling that I was stepping straight into the devil's den. Friday came faster than I expected. I dressed carefully, choosing the same sweater I'd worn the last time, so he'd think I was the same timid Helen he'd met before. But this time, there was a tiny recorder stitched into the lining of my handbag. When I entered his office, he stood to greet me, his eyes lingering just a fraction too long. "Helen," he said warmly, "I'm glad you came back. I was worried you might be holding back from what you really need." I sat down, forcing my hands to stay still in my lap. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said the other day," I replied. "About easing the pain." I made my voice sound hesitant, almost inviting. His smile widened. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk, and began speaking in that slow, deliberate tone that made my skin crawl. As he spoke, his words shifted from biblical comfort to something else. Something personal, something wrong. Every sentence felt like it was dripping with poison, and I prayed silently that the recorder was catching every word. Then he got up, walked around the desk, and stood behind me. I felt his hand rest lightly on my shoulder, his thumb brushing just a little too far. "You deserve special care, Helen. The kind I can give." Every muscle in my body screamed to get up, to shove him away, to run. But I stayed still, my face calm, my heart hammering in my chest. I needed him to keep talking. I needed him to condemn himself with his own words. And then, just as he leaned closer, his breath hot against my ear, the sound of the office door opening made us both jerk back. It was the secretary, holding a stack of papers, her eyes flicking between us. She mumbled something about leaving them on his desk and hurried out. He straightened his robe, clearing his throat. "We'll continue this another time." His smile was tight, almost forced. I walked out into the hall, my hands trembling, not from fear, but from the realization that I had just captured the first piece of evidence. But as I stepped outside into the cold air, my stomach dropped. Parked across the street was that same dark sedan. This time, I saw the driver's window roll down just slightly, and a cigarette tip glowed in the shadows. They weren't just watching me. They were waiting. The game had just shifted, and the danger was closer than ever. Don't miss what happens in the next chapter, because the next move could decide whether I bring a predator down or disappear before I get the chance. Like, comment, and subscribe so you're here when the truth comes to light. The glow of that cigarette burned into my mind long after I walked away from the church. My hands were tight around my handbag, the small recorder inside feeling heavier than it should. I didn't look back as I turned down the street toward home, but every nerve in my body was screaming that the sedan was still there, crawling slowly behind me. I took the long way home, weaving through side streets, pretending to look at shop windows, hoping whoever it was would lose interest. But when I finally reached my block, the car was parked just far enough down the road to keep watch. My chest tightened. This wasn't a coincidence anymore. This was surveillance. Robert was in the kitchen when I stepped inside, the smell of beer hanging in the air. "You're late," he said without looking up from the counter, where he was peeling the label off a bottle. "I stopped at the store," I lied easily, slipping past him to put my bag away. I didn't dare take the recorder out while he was around. If he found it, I'd have two predators to fight instead of one. All through dinner, I kept my eyes on him, trying to read his mood. He seemed distracted, lost in his own thoughts, but I knew better than to assume that meant I was safe. Sometimes Robert's quiet was worse than his shouting. That night, after he fell asleep in his chair, I locked myself in the bathroom, turned on the faucet, and pulled the recorder from my bag. My fingers trembled as I pressed play. There it was, Pastor James's voice, smooth and calculated, weaving between scripture and suggestion. His words growing darker with each sentence. I listened to him say things that would shatter his reputation if anyone else heard them. My stomach turned, but my resolve hardened. This wasn't just my word anymore. I had proof. The next day, I met Mary Lou in the back corner of the diner, the same booth where she'd first warned me. She leaned in as I slid the recorder across the table. "It's on here," I whispered. "Everything." She put on her glasses and pressed play, her face tightening as she listened. When it ended, she looked up at me with a mix of triumph and fear. "Helen, this is enough to start something. But once we do, there's no going back." I knew she was right. Taking down Pastor James would be like pulling the pin on a grenade in this town. The blast would reach everywhere. Friends, family, even the church board. But keeping it secret meant letting him keep doing this to others. Before we could decide the next step, Mary Lou glanced past me and froze. "Don't look now," she whispered. "But that same black sedan is across the street." My blood went cold. I didn't turn my head, but I could see the reflection in the diner window. Same tinted windows. Same slow, steady presence. Whoever was in that car wanted me to know I was being watched. We left separately, hoping to throw them off, but by the time I got home, Robert was standing on the porch with his arms crossed. "Funny," he said. "I heard you've been spending a lot of time with Mary Lou lately." I kept my voice even. "She's a friend." He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "Be careful about the friends you choose, Helen. Some people bring trouble with them." That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, realizing I was trapped in a tightening web. One wrong move and I could lose everything, not just my plan to expose Pastor James, but my safety, my freedom, maybe even my life. The next morning, Mary Lou called with news that made my heart stop. "Helen, Carla's missing. No one's seen her since yesterday." I felt the blood drain from my face. If they'd gotten to her, it meant the war had already begun. The fight I thought I was planning for had already found me, and it had claimed its first victim. If you've been following, like, comment, and subscribe, because in the next chapter, the lines between danger and survival will blur, and someone isn't coming out unscathed. The moment Mary Lou said Carla's name, my hands went cold. I gripped the phone tighter, my voice barely more than a whisper. "What do you mean she's missing?" "She didn't show up for work yesterday," Mary Lou said, her voice shaking. "Her neighbor said she saw a dark car parked outside her building that morning, and then nothing. She's not answering her phone. Her apartment's locked. It's like she vanished." The image of that black sedan flashed in my mind, the glow of the cigarette, the steady presence that had shadowed me for days. My stomach turned. This wasn't coincidence. This was a message. I pressed my hand against my forehead. "Mary Lou, we need to go to the police." She let out a bitter laugh. "And say what? That a respected pastor and some mystery man in a car are making women disappear? Without hard proof, they'll tell us we're paranoid. And if Pastor James catches wind of it, we'll be next." I wanted to argue, but she was right. The recorder was a start, but it was only one piece. We needed more, and we needed it fast, before anyone else ended up like Carla. That night, Robert came home later than usual. He smelled like alcohol, but there was something else. a smugness in the way he carried himself. He sat at the kitchen table, opened a beer, and stared at me without speaking. Finally he said, "You ever hear the phrase, 'curiosity killed the cat'?" He took a slow drink, never breaking eye contact. Some cats don't know when to stop poking around. My heart thudded hard in my chest. Was he talking about Carla? About me? I kept my voice calm, my hands busy at the sink. "I mind my own business." He smirked. "See that you do." After he went to bed, I pulled the recorder from my hiding place and listened again, committing every word to memory. I thought of Carla, her nervous eyes, her quiet voice. If she was gone because she trusted me enough to talk, I couldn't just stop now. I owed her more than that. The next morning I called Mary Lou. "We're going to the church tonight," I said. "After hours." She hesitated. "Helen." "I mean it," I cut in. "If he's done this to more women, there's something in that office. Letters, notes, maybe even recordings. Men like him don't destroy their trophies. We find them, we take them, and then we go to the police." That night, the air was cold enough to bite through my coat as we stood in the church parking lot. The building loomed over us, its stained glass windows dark without the glow of the sanctuary lights. Mary Lou's hands shook as she worked the spare key. Her late husband had been a deacon, and she'd never turned it in. Inside, the silence was suffocating. The smell of old wood and hymnals hung in the air. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a gunshot. We moved quickly down the hallway toward Pastor James's office. When we reached the door, I tried the knob. Mary Lou pulled a thin piece of metal from her purse, glancing at me with a faint smile. "Don't ask where I learned this." She worked the lock until it clicked. Inside, the office was exactly as I remembered. Books lining the shelves, a polished desk, the faint scent of cologne. I went straight to the filing cabinet while Mary Lou checked the desk drawers. It didn't take long. In the bottom drawer of the cabinet, under a stack of old church bulletins, I found a manila folder. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were photographs, women I recognized from church, some looking distressed, others caught in moments too intimate to mistake. And there, near the back, was Carla. Mary Lou's gasp told me she'd found something too. A small box of cassette tapes, each labeled with a woman's name and a date. We barely had time to process what we were holding before a sound froze us both. A step. Slow, deliberate, coming down the hall. I shoved the folder back into the drawer, but the tapes were still in Mary Lou's hands. The footsteps grew louder. Then a shadow filled the doorway. The man standing there wasn't Pastor James. It was worse. Much worse. And if you've been following this story, like, comment, and subscribe. Because in the next chapter, the mask comes off, and the truth about who's really behind the black sedan will leave you breathless. The man in the doorway wasn't Pastor James. It was Robert. He leaned against the frame, one hand resting casually on the wood, the other holding a half-crushed cigarette between his fingers. The smell of stale smoke curled into the room like a warning. His eyes dropped to the box of tapes in Mary Lou's hands, then back to me. "Well," he said slowly, almost amused. "Isn't this cozy?" My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would give me away. "Robert, what are you doing here?" My voice was steadier than I felt. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a soft click. "Funny thing," he said, circling the room slowly. "A man calls me earlier this week. Says my wife's been sneaking around behind my back. Says she's been talking to people she shouldn't. Says she's digging where she's not wanted." He stopped right in front of me. "Imagine my surprise when I find you here, at night, in the pastor's office." Mary Lou took a step forward. "Robert, this isn't what you think." He cut her off with a sharp laugh. "I know exactly what this is. And I know exactly who you're trying to take down. The question is, do you know what it'll cost you?" I could see it now, clear as day. Robert wasn't just my abusive husband. He was involved. He knew Pastor James well enough to be his messenger, his enforcer. That black sedan. It wasn't a stranger. It was him or someone working for him. And suddenly, Carla's disappearance didn't feel like an isolated warning. It felt like part of a larger, darker arrangement. I tightened my grip on the folder I had pulled from the cabinet. "What did you do to Carla?" asked, my voice shaking. He tilted his head, smirking. "Careful, Helen. Accusations like that can get you hurt." He reached out like he might take the folder from me, but I stepped back. Mary Lou, God bless her, found her courage. She slid the tapes into her oversized purse and said, "We're leaving. Move." Robert didn't budge. "You're not walking out of here with those." Something in me snapped. Maybe it was the months, years, of swallowing my fear, or maybe it was the sight of his smug face in a room full of evidence that could save women's lives. I straightened my back and said, "We're walking out, Robert. And if you try to stop us, every word on these tapes is going to the police by morning." His smirk faltered just for a second. That was enough for Mary Lou to push past him, forcing him to step aside. I followed, keeping my eyes forward, my hands tight on the folder. We didn't run. We walked steadily down that hallway, out the side door, and into the cold night. But the second we reached Mary Lou's car and slammed the doors shut, my chest finally loosened, and I let out a shaky breath. She started the engine, but her hands were trembling. "Helen, he's in on it. Your own husband." I nodded slowly, staring out at the empty street. "I know." We drove to her house, locked every door, and spread out what we had. The photos, the tapes, the notes I'd taken. It was enough to bring the whole thing crashing down. If we could get it to the right hands before Robert or Pastor James got to us first. But before we could even decide on our next move, Mary Lou's phone lit up on the table. One new message. From an unknown number. "You have something that belongs to me. You have 24 hours. I didn't need to ask who it was from. Already knew. The clock had started ticking, and by this time tomorrow either we'd be free or we'd be gone. Don't miss the next chapter because the final move in this deadly game is coming, and the price for losing will be everything. Like, comment, and subscribe so you're here for the end." The glow from Mary Lou's phone screen seemed to suck the air out of the room. That single message, "You have something that belongs to me. You have 24 hours, wasn't just a threat. It was a deadline on our lives. Mary Lou's hands shook as she set the phone down on the table. "Helen, we can't stay here. If they know we have this, they'll come." She was right. I could feel it deep in my bones. Pastor James wouldn't risk this evidence getting out, and Robert wouldn't hesitate to deliver me to him if it meant saving his own skin, or worse, earning his approval. I took a deep breath and steadied my voice. "Then we go to the police. Tonight." Mary Lou shook her head. "Not the local ones. He's too connected here. If we walk into that station, they'll tip him off before we can even explain." She was right again. This had to be bigger than our small town. We needed to go somewhere out of his reach, somewhere his influence couldn't protect him. And there was only one option I could think of: driving 2 hours to the county sheriff's department in the next district. We packed everything, tapes, photos, my notes, into 2 separate bags so if one of us was caught, the other still had something. Then we slipped out through her back door into the freezing night, moving like fugitives. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. As we reached her car, my breath caught. There it was. The black sedan parked across the street, engine running. Mary Lou whispered, "Get in now." We slid into her car and pulled out fast, heading toward the highway. In the rear-view mirror, the sedan followed, its headlights steady, unblinking. My palms were slick with sweat as I clutched my bag. Mary Lou tried to lose them, taking back roads and side streets, but they stayed right on us. It was like they knew exactly where we were going. My mind raced. Had Robert put something on me? A tracker. We hit the county line an hour later, and for a brief, shining moment, I thought we'd shaken them. But just as we turned onto the last road toward the sheriff's office, the sedan's headlights flared in the mirror again. "They're speeding up," Mary Lou said, her voice tight. "Drive straight to the station," I urged, my hand gripping the dash. "Don't stop. No matter what." We pulled into the lot, tires squealing, and ran for the doors with our bags. The deputies inside looked up in surprise, but before we could speak, Mary Lou slammed the tapes onto the counter. "You need to hear this. And if you're in on it, you better walk away because this will end careers." The sheriff himself came out, frowning, and took the tapes into his office. For the next hour we sat in that lobby, shaking, every creak of the door making my stomach lurch. When he finally came back, his face was grim. "These are going to change things. I'm putting you both under protective custody tonight. We're issuing a warrant for James's arrest by morning." The relief was almost too much to process, but I knew better than to celebrate. Pastor James wouldn't go down quietly. By sunrise the news had broken. Our small town was buzzing, the man they once called a shepherd now revealed for what he really was. Robert was arrested alongside him, charged as an accomplice for helping intimidate and silence victims. I stood outside the sheriff's office, the cold morning air filling my lungs, and for the first time in years, I felt the weight on my chest lift. Mary Lou stood beside me, squeezing my hand. "I guess we did it," she said. "No," I replied quietly. "We survived. That's only the start." Because I knew this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every woman who had been told to keep quiet, every survivor who thought no one would believe her. If you're listening to this, I want you to remember, evil doesn't always come kicking down your door. Sometimes it smiles from a pulpit or sits at your dinner table. And when you see it for what it is, you have two choices: run or fight. Chose to fight. If this story has moved you, if it's made you think about your own strength, like, comment and subscribe because your voice matters. And if you've been silent for too long, maybe this is the sign you've been waiting for to finally speak.